Good evening and welcome to The Report with me, John Rees. In tonight's programme we'll be looking at the success of the Islamic finance company Oasis Crescent, which has just won an award for helping to bring Sharia compliant services to the attention of the world. We'll also be looking at what the Palestinian Authority has to say about Israel's rejection of a French-sponsored peace initiative. But first, the anti-Semitism row embroiling the Labour Party continues, with many senior figures within the party criticising the handling of the row by Jeremy Corbyn. There were even more critical remarks made about Ken Livingstone yesterday, which led to his suspension. But Livingstone has defended himself, insisting that he's not an anti-Semite. So what is anti-Semitism, and is the attempt to equate anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism endangering the reputation of the Labour Party? Our Home Affairs Correspondent, Afzal Ahmed, has this report.
Ken Livingstone, over the last 24 hours, has been slowly losing the support of many high-ranking figures within his own party. He maintains that everything is true and that he will be presenting evidence to prove that. The controversy started after he said that Adolf Hitler was a supporter of Zionism before he carried out the Holocaust. This was in the same breath in the defense of his colleague Naz Shah and his party against allegations of anti-Semitism. But his opponents have criticised him for his inappropriate comments and have accused him of what he was defending against. In the interview with BBC Radio London, he also said there was a very well-orchestrated campaign by the Israel lobby to smear anybody who criticised Israeli policy as anti-Semitic, and that he had to put up with this for 35 years.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
So is this still carrying on in 2016 and perpetuated now by his very own colleagues? The issue seems to lie with the difference between what constitutes anti-Semitism and what constitutes a criticism of the State of Israel, or in other words, anti-Zionism. Anti-Semitism is generally defined as a hostility and prejudice directed against Jewish people. The US Department of State, in a report in 2005, described it as the hatred towards Jews, individually and as a group, that can be attributed to the Jewish religion and or ethnicity. Zionism, on the other hand, is a political ideology which refers to the movement to create a Jewish state in the Middle East, corresponding to the historic land of Israel. This has generally been contested, positive or negative, since it emerged in 1897 by non-Jews as well as Jews. But some have said the term Zionist has been used as a coded and disguised attack on Jews. The Labour peer Lord Levi said yesterday that there can be criticism of the State of Israel, but anti-Semitism, using the word Zionist as another form of anti-Semitism, frankly can no longer be tolerated. Critics of anti-Zionists also point out that sometimes particularly harsh criticism of Israel goes further than disagreement with policies, but rather delegitimizes the very existence of the Jewish state. On the other hand, opponents say accusations of anti-Semitism are deployed to silence criticism of the Israeli government or to further other political ends. The Jewish socialist group said today that accusations of anti-Semitism were being weaponized to attack the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn. So agreement on exactly how the two relate appears elusive. But in the meantime, its fluidity and vagueness risks destroying the reputation of the Labour Party. Afzal Ahmed, The Report.
Well, now joining me to discuss all that is the chair of the Islamic Human Rights Commission, Massoud Shadjerah, and Paul Usiskin, who's a commentator on Middle Eastern affairs. Paul, welcome to the programme. There's a long-standing discussion, obviously, that we've all been part of over the years, I guess, about the distinction between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Do you think that this current dispute is obscuring a sensible debate, or is it clarifying it?
I think at the moment where we are is that the debate is being obscured. It's got to a point where you cannot pry apart anti-Semitism from anti-Zionism. You can't have a conversation about what Israel is doing vis-a-vis the Palestinians without the issue of anti-Semitism creeping in somewhere, and that makes it very unhealthy. And currently something else is going on as well, and that is that there is an acceptance of a lazy form of anti-Semitism, a kind of acceptable racism that wasn't there before, doesn't just apply to Jews, but it also applies to other ethnic minorities in this country. But right now, the focus is on the Jewish community.
And do you think that was a lazy formulation, to put it that in your words, that Ken Livingstone used?
I think Ken Livingstone has to be seen in a quite specific context, all of his own. If you think about this from a purely Labour perspective, why would somebody so prominent in Labour circles, days before a crucial election, mayoral and assembly and council across this country, suddenly start talking about an issue which won't do the party any good in that context? And there are those who say that Ken Livingstone is now a law unto himself, is too old to really recognise the mayhem he creates by the things he says, and it's potentially very, very bad for the Labour Party next week.
Massoud Shadjerah, what do you feel about this debate? I mean, it's always been a tenet in the Palestinian solidarity movement to make a very strong distinction between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and as you and I both know, there's been considerable efforts always to include Jewish voices in the Palestine solidarity movement. Do you think we're getting to a point where that distinction is much more difficult to make in the midst of this row?
Well, I think, you know, those of us who've been involved in support of the Palestinian cause, we have seen for many years attempts to sort of silence any critic of the state of Israel and the Zionism by, you know, associating with with the Jewish faith. Those of us who were at Durban in 2001, we saw a huge attempt by State of Israel, United States, and some of the European states and their supporters to actually implement that. And it backfired. And just to remind everybody, what happened was the NGO forum actually came the other way around and actually said that Zionism is actually a form of racism. And then Israel and United States walked out of the conference. But the reality is that, you know, this is being used against us all the time. And even though the fact is that, you know, there are many Jews, both religious Jews and the secular Jews, who are our partners. In some ways, they're actually forefront of the whole movement. And they're being accused of being self-hating Jews. So really, these terminology is being used to silence people. But the fact of the matter is, not every Zionist is a Jew, and not every Jew is a Zionist. And this is a fact. And, and we really need to get on with it. One of the problems, I think, what happened to the Labour Party after the leadership of Jeremy was they got this amazing attack at the outset of his election. And I think wrongfully, the Labour Party did a sort of backstepping on this. And the more they do that, the more vigorous this attack by Zionists and their supporters is going to be. They got used to the concept that every leader of every party, for as long as I can remember, has been a member of Friend of Israel, either through the Labour Party or Conservative Party or Liberal Democrat. And now this is the first time for many, many years that, you know, we have a leader of the Labour Party who actually stands for the justice in occupied territories and in the Middle East. And for that, he's going to be attacked. And I think, you know, yes, of course, we get from time to time some Palestinian supporters saying things which is really not helpful. But to say that, or even ridiculous, but the fact to turn around and turn it into anti-Semitism, it really is outrageous. And one other point is that if we have one standard for identifying and defining what anti-Semitism is, but another standards when it comes to Islamophobia, another standard when it comes to racial sort of abuses and racial discrimination, then we ourselves are discriminating against others. And this is what, unfortunately, we see being promoted.
Paul, the Jewish Socialist Group statement that we quoted in that package said that this issue is being weaponised by the Labour right wing. It's certainly become entangled with the struggle inside the Labour Party in an unhelpful way, would you say?
I don't buy that. I'm afraid I didn't hear the package for some reason that didn't reach me, but I don't buy that view. I think you've got two rather prominent contexts over the last few days, which make it very difficult to simply sweep all of this under the table and start pointing fingers at Jews or otherwise in the right wing of the Labour Party. You had two people, one of whom made a tweet about something to do with Israel in the war, during the war in Gaza, which, to be quite frank, I didn't think was terribly helpful, but I also didn't think you needed to sort of pick this up and run with it to get her to resign. But then you had Ken Livingstone, and despite my earlier comments about him, the comments that he made about what is an anti-Semite, etc., and this nonsensical reference to Hitler being a Zionist, you can't have all of this stuff going on and pretend that it's all the right wing and some Jews in the Labour Party doing it. Furthermore, you can't just ignore that within the Labour Party there isn't just anti-Semitic expressions not only being expressed in the context I've mentioned, but all over Facebook on a very frequent basis, but there's also fairly overt racism towards people from the Asian community. The BBC reported on it a month ago, of young women and older women in Southeast Asia, in the Midlands and north of England, wanting to be part of the Labour Party and finding themselves discriminated against. Whether Jews like it or not, that's another example of racism, and that has to be stopped within the Labour Party. Otherwise, how can it be a convincing party for all of these people to elect?
Paul, you sound as if you think there is quite a deep-seated problem. I mean, I was looking at one article which sort of detailed the complaints. There were 8 complaints of anti-Semitism against individuals. They were all dealt with within 48 hours. Now, that's not to say there isn't a problem, and that where that problem exists, it should be dealt with robustly and quickly. But do you think the Labour Party is failing to do that, as some of Jeremy Corbyn's critics say?
I have a feeling that Jeremy Corbyn is being held to task, particularly over the Ken Livingstone suspension. And there are those who feel that it took him too long to do what he did. Although I'm not necessarily a fan of Jeremy Corbyn, although I'm a member of the party, I think that when he had to suspend somebody who's been an ally of his for over 40 years, he would need to think about that, like any other party leader would need to think about it. The fact that he did it in the same day is good enough.
And Massoud, on this wider picture, I mean, it certainly is, it seems, now inextricably bound up with the argument in the Labour Party. But in a way, there's something more important at stake here, and that is that an argument inside the Labour Party has magnified an attack on the idea that you can be a critic of Israel and at the same time a firm opponent of anti-Semitism. And that's going to be a very damaging thing over the long term, is it not?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I actually find it totally unacceptable that, the right of being standing against anti-Semitism in the same time standing against the Zionist abuses is being denied to many of us. And that is really outrageous. And I think we need to deal with that if we are going to move forward, being able to discuss and argue on things. And the other aspect is that, yes, of course, we have ills in our society. No political party, no grouping, no society could deal with these things once and for all. The reality is that we need to go back and be vigilant of anti-Semitism. We need to be vigilant of Islamophobia, and we need to be vigilant of racism. But look around. Which of the political parties are more involved in these acts of sort of abuse and discrimination? And why is it that people could get away with racism, sexism? They could get even away with child abuse much more than they could get away with sort of criticizing the state of Israel. And I think we need to actually look at this and really address it properly. I am sure many of us, and many of us in the sort of pro-Palestinian camp really deplore any act of anti-Semitism, but it's being used as a tool against most of us on a day in and day out, and we are really fed up with it. And we need to actually raise our voice if we are going to make sure that these political structures are actually addressing the real issues that we want to be addressed.
Okay, Massoud Shadjerah and Paul Usiskin.